Book 5, Chapter 1, Part 2 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain René Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Book 5, Chapter 1, Part 2. "Oh, then, it is quite another matter," said the alguazil. "I only come to your house for the purpose of assuring you that this young man is no impostor. You have the authority of a parent over your child, and no one has any right to dictate to you how you are to marry her, and whether you will or no. Neither do I, on my part," interrupted Pedro, "pretend to lay any force on the inclinations of Signor de Moyadas, but he will perhaps allow me to ask him why he has so suddenly changed his resolution. Has he any reason to be dissatisfied with me? Alas, let me at least understand that in losing the sweet hope of becoming his son-in-law, my promised bliss has not been wrested from me by any misconduct of my own." "I have no complaint to make of you," answered the old man. "Nay, I will even tell you more. It is with sincere sorrow that I find myself under the necessity of breaking my word with you, and I heartily beseech you to forgive me for having done so. I am persuaded that you are too generous to bear me any ill will for having thrown the balance into the scale of a rival who has saved my life. You see him here," pursued he, introducing my noble self. "This is the illustrious personage who threw round me the shield of his protection in my great peril. And the better still to apologize for my seemingly harsh treatment of yourself, you are to know that he is an Italian prince." At these last words Pedro was dumbfounded, and looked as if he could not help it. The two tradesmen opened their eyes as wide as they could stare, with surprise at finding themselves for the first time in princely society. But the alguazil, in the habit of looking at things with the cross eye of suspicion, divined most perspicuously that this marvellous adventure must be a complete humbug, and the verification of the prophecy was calculated to put money into the pocket of the prophet. He therefore conned over my countenance with a very inquisitive regard, but as my features, which were now new to justice, threw him out most cruelly from hunting down the game he was in chase of, he had no alternative but to try his luck on my companion. Unfortunately for my highness of the inaccessible valleys, he knew again the hangdog features of Morales, and recollecting to have seen him within the purlieus of a jail, "Ay, ay," exclaimed he, "this is one of my established customers. This gentleman is a particular acquaintance of mine, and you may take his character from me for one of the rankest rascals within the kingdoms and principalities of Spain. Softly, look before you leap, most adventurous alguazil," said Jerome de Moyadas. "This lad, of whom you draw so unfavourable a picture, is in the travelling retinue of a prince." "So much the better," retorted the alguazil. "A man would not desire clear evidence on which to bring in his verdict. If we can but hang the servant, we shall soon send the master to the devil. The case is as undeniable as a feed counsel's plea. These pleasant sparks are a couple of fortune hunters, who have laid their heads together to take you in. I am an old hound upon this scent, so that by way of proof presumptive that these merry vagabonds are within the contemplation of the law in that case provided, I shall lodge them where they will be well taken care of. They will have plenty of time for meditation under the chastising philosophy of a turnkey. Or should refinement fail to mend their morals, we have a sort of tangible discipline, which insinuates reformation by the inlet of a smarting hide." "Stop there, and bethink you in good time, master officer," rejoined the old gentleman. "We must not draw the cord tighter than it will bear. You never make any bones, you hangers on of the law, about hurting the feelings of better men than yourselves. May not this servant be a common cheat, without his master being a swindler? Princes are persons of honour, as a matter of course. Yet the retainers to a court are inordinate rascals. It requires no conjurer to find that out. Are you playing into the hands of your deluders with your princes? Interrupted the alguazil. This new manufacturer of false pretences is a proficient, take my word for it. But I shall quench his zeal in the service, and gravel the ingenuity of his partner with a whereas and a commitment in due form. The scouts of justice are all round the door, who will worry their game every inch of the chase, if they do not suffer themselves to be taken quietly on their form. So come along, may it please your serene highness, let us proceed to our destination. This upshot of the business was a death blow to me as well as to Morales, and our confusion did but infuse doubts into the mind of Jerome de Moyadas, or rather burned, sunk, and destroyed us in his esteem. He began rather to think, not without reason, that we had some little design to impose on his credulity. Nevertheless, he acted on this occasion in the spirit of a man of honour and a gentleman. My good friend and protector, said he to the alguazil, your conjectures may be without foundation. On the other hand, they may turn out to have too much truth in them. Whichever of these alternatives may be the fact, let us not look too curiously into their characters. They are both young, and have time enough for amendment if they want it. Let them go their ways, and withdraw whithersoever it may best please them. Make no opposition, I beseech you, to their safe egress. It is a favour which you may consider as done to me, and my motive for asking it is to acquit myself of my debt to them. If my heart was not too soft for my profession, answered the alguazil, I should lodge these pretty gentlemen in limbo, in defiance of all your pleadings in their favour, but your eloquence and my susceptibility have relaxed the stern demeanour of justice for this evening. Let them, however, leave town on the spur of the occasion, for if I come across them to-morrow, and there is any faith in an alguazil, they shall see such sport as will be no sport to them. When it was signified to Morales and me, culprits as we were, that we were to be let off scot-free, we polished up the brass upon our foreheads a little. It was time now to bounce and swagger, and to maintain that we were men of undeniable respectability. But the alguazil looked askew at us, and muttered that least said was soonest mended. I do not know how, but those gentry have a strange knack of curbing our genius. They are complete lords of the ascendant. Florence and her dowry therefore were lost to Pedro de la Membrilla by a turn of the dice, and we may conclude that he was received as the son-in-law of Jerome de Moyadas. I took to my heels with my companion. We blundered on the road to Truxillo, with the consolation at our hearts of having at least pocketed 100 pistoles by our frolic. An hour before nightfall we passed through a little village with the intention of putting up for the evening at the next stage. An inn of very tolerable appearance for the place attracted our notice. The landlord and landlady were sitting at the door on a long bench, such as usually graces a pothouse porch. Our host, a tall man, withered, and with one foot in the grave, was tinkling on a cracked guitar to the unbounded emolument of his wife, whose faculties seemed to hang in rapture on the performance. Gentlemen, cried out the intrepid tavern keeper, when he found that we were not upon the halt, you will do well to stop here, you may fare worse further off. There is a devil of 3 leagues to the nearest village, and you will find nothing to make you amends for what you leave behind, you may assure yourselves of that. Take a word of advice, know when you are well used. I will treat you with the fat of the land, and charge you at the lowest rate. There was no resisting such a plea. We came up to our courteous entertainers, paid them the compliments of course, and sitting down by their side, the conversation was supported by all 4 on the indifferent topics of the day. Our host announced himself as an officer of the Holy Brotherhood, and his rib was a fat, laughing squab of a woman, with outward good nature, but with an eye to make the most of her commodities. Our discourse was broken in upon by the arrival of from 12 to 15 riders, some mounted on mules, others on horseback, followed by about 30 sumpter mules laden with packages. "Ah, what a princely retinue!" exclaimed the landlord at the sight of so much company. "Where can I put them all?" In an instant the village was crammed full of men and beasts. As luck would have it, there was near the inn an immense barn where the sumpter mules and their packages were secured. The saddle mules and horses were taken care of in other places. As for their masters, they thought less about bespeaking beds than about calling for the bill of fare and ordering a good supper. The host and hostess, with a servant girl whom they kept, were all upon the alert to make things agreeable. They laid a heavy hand upon all the fowls in the poultry yard. These precious roasts, with some undisguised rabbits, cats, in the masquerade of a fricassee, and a deluging tureen of soup, stinking of cabbage and greasy with mutton fat, were enough to have given a sickener to the inveterate stomachs of a regiment. As for Morales and myself, we cast a scrutinizing eye on these troopers, nor were they behindhand in passing their secret judgments upon us. At last we came together in conversation, and it was proposed on our part, if they had no objection, that we should all sup together. They assured us that they should be extremely happy in our company. Here we are then all seated round the table. There was one among them who seemed to take the lead, and for whom the rest, though in the main they were on the most intimate terms with him, thought it necessary on some occasions to testify their deference. In case of a dispute, this high gentleman assumed the umpire. He talked in a tone above the common pitch, going so far sometimes as to contradict, in no very courtly phrase, the sentiments of others, who, far from giving him back his own, were ready to swear to his assertions and crouch under his rebuke. By accident the discourse turned on Andalusia. Morales happening to launch out into the praise of Seville, the man about whom I have been talking said to him, "My good fellow traveller, you are ringing the chimes on the city which gave birth to me. At least I am a native of the neighbourhood, since the little town of Merina is answerable for my appearance in the world." "I have the same story to tell you," answered my companion. "I am also a Merina, and it is scarcely possible but that our families should be acquainted. Whose son are you?" "An honest notary's," replied the stranger, "by name Martin Morales." "As fate will have it," exclaimed my comrade with emotion, "the adventure is very remarkable. You are then my eldest brother, Manuel Morales." "Exactly so," said the other, "and if my senses do not deceive me, you, your very self, are my little brother Louis, whom I left in the cradle when I turned my back upon my father's house." "You are right in your conjectures," answered my honest colleague. At this discovery they both got up from table, and almost hugged the breath out of each other's bodies. At last Signor Manuel said to the company, "Gentlemen, this circumstance is altogether marvellous. By mere chance I have met with a brother, and have been challenged by him whom I have not seen for more than 20 years. Allow me to introduce him." At once all the travellers, who had risen from their seats out of curiosity and good manners, paid their compliments to the younger Morales, and made him run the gauntlet through their salutations. When these were over, the party returned to the table, nor did they think any more of an adjournment. Bedtime never entered into their heads. The two brothers sat next to one another, and talked in a whisper about their family affairs. The other guests plied the bottle, and made merry in a louder key. Louis had a long conference with Manuel, and afterwards, taking me aside, said to me, "All these troopers belong to the household of the Count de Montanos, whom the king has very lately appointed to the vice-regal government of Majorca. They are convoying the equipage of the viceroy to Alicant, where they are to embark." My brother, who has risen to be steward to that nobleman, proposes to take me along with him, and on the difficulty I started about leaving you, he told me that if you would be of the party, he would procure you a good berth. My dear friend, pursued he, I advise you not to stand out against this proposal. Let us take flight together for the island of Majorca. If we find our quarters pleasant, we will fix there, and if they are otherwise, we have nothing to do but to return into Spain. I accepted of the proposal with the best grace possible. What a reinforcement in the person of young Morales and myself to the household of the Count! We took our departure in a body from the inn before daybreak. We got to the city of Alicant by long stages, and there I bought a guitar and arranged my dress in a manner suited to my new destination before we embarked. Nothing ran in my head but the island of Majorca, and Luis Morales was a new man as well as myself. It should seem as though we had bid farewell to the rogueries of this wicked world. Yet, not to play the liar in the ear of so rigorous a confessor as my own conscience, we had a mind not to pass for villains incarnate, now that we had got into company that had some pretensions to decency, and that was the sum total of our honesty. The natural bent of our genius remained much the same. We were still men of business, but just now keeping a vacation. In short, we went on board gallantly and gaily in this lucid interval of innocence, and had no idea but of landing at Majorca under the especial care of Neptune and Aeolus. Hardly, however, had we cleared the Gulf of Alicant, when a sudden and violent storm arose, enough to have frightened better men. Now is my opportunity or never to speak of moving accidents by flood, to set the atmosphere on fire and give a louder explosion to the thundercloud, to compare the whistling of the winds to the factions of a populace, and the rolling of the waves to the shock of conflicting hosts, with other such old-fashioned phraseologies as have been heirlooms of Parnassus from time immemorial. But it is useless to be poetical without invention. Suffice it therefore to say, in slang metaphor, that the storm was a devil of a storm, and obliged us to stand in for the point of Cabrera. This is a desert island with a small fort, at that time garrisoned by an officer and 5 or 6 soldiers. Our reception was hospitable and cordial. As it was necessary for us to stay there some days for the purpose of refitting our sails and rigging, we devised various kinds of amusements to keep off the foul fiend melancholy. Every one did as seemed good in his own eyes. Some played at cards, others diverted themselves in other ways, but as for me, I went about exploring the island, with such of our gentry as had either a curiosity or a taste for the picturesque. We were frequently obliged to clamber from rock to rock, for the face of the country is rugged and the soil scanty, presenting a scene difficult of access, but interesting from its wildness. One day, while we were speculating on these dry and barren prospects, and extracting a moral from the vagaries of nature, who can swell into the fruitful mother and the copious nurse, or shrink into the lean and loathsome skeleton as she pleases, our sense was all at once regaled with a most delicious fragrance. We turned, as with a common impulse, towards the east, whence the scented gale seemed to come. To our utter astonishment, we discovered among the rocks a green plat of considerable dimensions, gay with honeysuckles, more luxuriant and more odorous than even those which thrive so greatly in the climate of Andalusia. We were not sorry to approach nearer these delicious shrubs, which were wasting their sweetness in such unchecked profusion, when it turned out that they lined the entrance of a very deep cavern. The opening was wide, and the recess in consequence partially illuminated. We were determined to explore, and descended by some stone steps overgrown with flowers on each side, so that it was difficult to say whether the approach was formed by art or nature. When we had got down, we saw several little streams winding over a sand, the yellow lustre of which outrivaled gold. These drew their sources from the continual distillations of the rock within, and lost themselves again in the hollows of the ground. The water looked so clear that we were tempted to drink of it, and such was its freshness that we made a party to return the next day, with some bottles of generous wine, which we were persuaded would acquire new zest from the retreat where they were to be quaffed. It was not without regret that we left so agreeable a place, nor did we omit, on our return to the fort, boasting among our comrades of so interesting a discovery. The commander of the fortress, however, with the warmest professions of friendship, warned us against going any more to the cavern with which we were so much delighted. And why so? Said I. Is there anything to be afraid of? Most undoubtedly, answered he. The corsairs of Algiers and Tripoli sometimes land upon this island for the purpose of watering at that spring. One day they surprised 2 soldiers of my garrison there, whom they carried into slavery. It was in vain that the officer assumed a tone of kind dissuasion. Nothing could prevent us from going. We fancied that he meant to play upon our fears, and the day following I returned to the cavern with 3 adventurous blades of our establishment. We were even foolhardy enough to leave our firearms behind as a sort of bravado. Young Morales declined being of the party. The fort and the gaming table had more charms for him, as well as for his brother. We went down to the bottom of the cave, as on the preceding day, and set some bottles of the wine we had brought with us to cool in the rivulets. While we were enjoying them in all the luxury of elegant conviviality, our wits set in motion by the novelty of the scene, and the echo reverberating to the music of our guitars, we espied at the mouth of the cavern several abominable faces overgrown with whiskers. Neither did their turbans and Turkish dresses render them a whit more amiable in our conceits. We nevertheless took it into our heads that it was a frolic of our own party, set on by the commanding officer of the fort, and that they had disguised themselves for the purpose of playing us a trick. With this impression on our minds, we set up a horse laugh, and allowed a quiet entrance to about 10, without thinking of making any resistance. In a few moments our eyes were opened to that fatal error, and we were convinced, in sober sadness, that it was a corsair at the head of his crew, come to carry us away. "Surrender, you Christian dogs," cried he in most outlandish Castilian, "or prepare for instant death." At the same time the men who accompanied him levelled their pieces at us, and our ribs would have been well lined with the contents if we had resisted in the least. Slavery seemed the better alternative than death, so that we delivered our swords to the pirate. He ordered us to be handcuffed and carried on board his vessel, which was moored not far off. Then, setting sail, he steered with a fair wind towards Algiers. Thus were we punished for having neglected the warning given us by the officer of the garrison. The first thing the corsair did was to put his hand into our pockets and make free with our money. No bad windfall for him. The 200 pistoles from the greenhorns at Placentia, the 100 which Morales had received from Jerome de Moyadas, and which, as ill luck would have it, were in my custody, all this was swept away without a single qualm of conscience. My companions, too, had their purses well lined, and it was all fish that came to the net. The pirate seemed to chuckle at so successful a drag, and the scoundrel, not contented with chousing us of our cash, insulted us with his infernal Moorish witticisms. But the edge of his satire was not half so keen as the dire necessity which made us the subject of it. After 1,000 clumsy sarcasms, he called for the bottles which we had set to cool in the fountain. Those irreligious Mahometans, not having scrupled to load their consciences with the conveyance of the unholy fermentation, the master and his man pledged one another in many a Christian bumper, and drank to our better acquaintance with a most provoking mockery. While this farce was acting, my comrades wore a hanging look, which testified how pleasantly their thoughts were employed. They were so much the more out of conceit with their captivity, as they thought they had drawn a prize in the lottery of human life. The island of Majorca, with all its luxuries and delights, was a melancholy contrast with their present situation. For my part, I had the good sense to take things as I found them. Less put out of my way by my misfortune than the rest, I joined in conversation with this transmarine joker, and showed him that wit was the common language of Africa and of Europe. He was pleased with my accommodating spirit. Young man, said he, instead of groaning and sighing, you do well to arm yourself with patience, and to fall in with the current of your destiny. Play us a little air, continued he, observing that I had a guitar by my side. Let us have a specimen of your skill. I complied with his command as soon as my arms were loosened from their confinement, and began to thrum away in a style that drew down the applauses of my discerning audience. It is true that I had been taught by the best master in Madrid, and that I played very tolerably for an amateur upon that instrument. A song was then called for, and my voice gave equal satisfaction. All the Turks on board testified by gestures of admiration the delight with which my performance inspired them, from which circumstance it was but modest to conclude that vocal music had made no very extraordinary progress in their part of the world. The pirate whispered in my ear that my slavery should be no disadvantage to me, and that with my talents I might reckon upon an employment by which my lot would be rendered not only supportable but happy. I felt somewhat encouraged by these assurances, but flattering as they were, I was not without my uneasiness as to the employment which the corsair held out as a nameless but invaluable boon. When we arrived in the port of Algiers, a great number of persons were collected to receive us, and we had not yet disembarked when they uttered 1,000 shouts of joy. Add to this, that the air re-echoed with a confused sound of trumpets, of Moorish flutes, and of other instruments, the fashion of that country, forming a symphony of deafening clangor, but very doubtful harmony. The occasion of these rejoicings proceeded from a false report which had been current about the town. It had been the general talk that the renegado Mahomet, meaning our amiable pirate, had lost his life in the attack of a large Genoese vessel, so that all his friends, informed of his return, were eager to hail him with these thundering demonstrations of attachment. We had no sooner set foot on shore than my companions and myself were conducted to the palace of the Bashaw Soliman, where a Christian secretary, questioning us individually one after another, inquired into our names, our ages, our country, our religion, and our qualifications. Then Mahomet, presenting me to the Bashaw, paid my voice more compliments than it deserved, and told him that I played on the guitar with a most ravishing expression. This was enough to influence Soliman in his choice of me for his own immediate service. I took up my abode therefore in his seraglio. The other captives were led into the public market and sold there at the usual rate of Christian cattle. What Mahomet had foretold to me on shipboard was completely verified. My condition was exactly to my mind. I was not consigned to the stronghold of a prison, nor kept to any works of oppressive labour. My indulgent master stationed me in a particular quarter with 5 or 6 slaves of superior rank, who were in momentary expectation of being ransomed, and were therefore favoured in the distribution of our tasks. The care of watering the orange trees and flowers in the gardens was allotted as my portion. There could not be a more agreeable or less fatiguing employment. Soliman was a man about 40 years of age, well made as to figure, tolerably accomplished as to his mind, and as much of a lady's man as could be expected from a Turk. His favourite was a Cashmerian, whose wit and beauty had acquired an absolute dominion over his affections. He loved her even to idolatry. Not a day but he paid his court to her by some elegant entertainment. At one time a concert of vocal and instrumental music, at another a dramatic performance after the fashion of the Turks, which fashion implies a loose sort of comedy, where moral and modesty enter about as much into the contemplation of the contriver as do Aristotle and his unities. The favourite, whose name was Farrukh Naz, was passionately enamoured of these exhibitions. She sometimes even got up among her own women some Arabian melodrames to be performed before her admirer. She took some of the parts herself, and charmed the spectators by the abundant grace and vivacity of her action. One day, when I was among the musicians at one of these representations, Soliman ordered me to play on the guitar and to sing a solo between the acts of the piece. I had the good fortune to give satisfaction, and was received with applause. The favourite herself, if my vanity did not mislead me, cast glances towards me of no unfavourable interpretation. On the next day, as I was watering the orange trees in the gardens, there passed close by me an eunuch, who, without stopping or saying a word, threw down a note at my feet. I picked it up with an emotion strangely compounded of pleasure and alarm. I crouched upon the ground for fear of being observed from the windows of the seraglio, and concealing myself behind the boxes in which the orange trees were planted, opened this unexpected enclosure. There I found a diamond of very considerable value, and these words in genuine Castilian: "Young Christian, return thanks to heaven for your captivity. Love and fortune will render it the harbinger of your bliss. Love, if you are alive to the attractions of a fine person, and fortune, if you have the hardihood to confront danger in every direction." I could not for a moment doubt that the letter was written by the favourite sultana. The style and the diamond were more than presumptive evidence against her. Besides that, nature did not cast me in the mould of a coward. The vanity of keeping up a good understanding with the mistress of a scoundrelly Mahometan in office, and more than all the temptations of vanity or inclination, the hope of cajoling her out of 4 times as much as the curmudgeon her master would demand for my ransom, put me into conceit, with the intention of trying my luck at a venture, whatever risk might be incurred in the experiment. I went on with my gardening, but always harping on the means of getting into the apartment of Farrukh Naz, or rather waiting till she opened a door of communication, for I was clearly of opinion that she would not stop upon the threshold, but meet me halfway in the career of love and danger. My conjecture was not altogether without foundation. The same eunuch who had led me into this amorous reverie passed the same way an hour afterwards, and said to me: "Christian, have you communed with your own determinations, and will you win a fair lady by abjuring a faint heart?" I answered in the affirmative. "Well then," rejoined he, "heaven sprinkle its dew upon your resolutions. You shall see me betimes to-morrow morning." With this comfortable assurance he withdrew. The following day I actually saw him make his appearance about 8 o'clock in the morning. He made a signal for me to go along with him. I obeyed the summons, and he conducted me into a hall, where was a large wrapper of canvas, which he and another eunuch had just brought thither, with the design of carrying it to the sultana's apartment, for the purpose of furnishing a scene for an Arabian pantomime in preparation for the amusement of the bashaw. The 2 eunuchs unrolled the cloth and laid me at my length on the proscenium. Then, at the risk of turning the farce into a tragedy by stifling me, they rolled it up again with its palpitating contents. In the next place, taking hold of it at each end, they conveyed me with impunity by this device into the chamber devoted to the repose of the beautiful Cashmerian. She was alone with an old slave devoted to her wishes. They helped each other to unroll their precious bale of goods, and Farrukh Naz, at the sight of her consignment, set up such an alarm of delight as exhibited the woman of the East, without forgetting her prurient propensities. With all my natural bias towards adventure, I could not recognize myself as at once transported into the private apartment of the women, without something like an inauspicious damp upon my joy. The lady was aware of my feelings, and anxious to dissipate the unpleasant part of them. Young man, said she, you have nothing to fear. Soliman is just gone to his country house. He is safely lodged for the day, so that we shall be able to entertain one another here at our ease. Hints like these rallied my scattered spirits, and gave a cast to my countenance which confirmed the speculation of the favourite. You have won my heart, pursued she, and it is in my contemplation so often the severity of your bondage. You seem to be worthy of the sentiments which I have conceived for you. Though disguised under the garb of a slave, your air is noble, and your physiognomy of a character to recommend you to the good graces of a lady. Such an exterior must belong to one above the common. Unbosom yourself to me in confidence. Tell me who you are. I know that captives of superior condition and family disguise their real circumstances to be redeemed at a lower rate. But you have no inducement to practice such a deception on me, and it would even be a precaution revolting to my designs in your favour, since I here pledge myself for your liberty. Deal with sincerity, therefore, and own to me at once that you are a youth of illustrious rank. In good earnest then, madam, answered I, it would ill become me to repay your generous partiality with dissimulation. You are absolutely bent upon it that I should entrust you with the secret of my quality, and commands like yours are not to be questioned or resisted. I am the son of a Spanish grandee. And so it might actually have been, for anything that I know to the contrary. At all events, the Sultana gave me credit for it, so that with considerable self-congratulation at having fixed her regard on a gentleman of some little figure in the world, she assured me that it only depended on herself whether or no we should meet pretty often in private. In fact, we were no niggards of our mutual goodwill at the very first approaches. I never met with a woman who was more what a man wishes her to be. She was, besides, an expert linguist, above all in Castilian, which she spoke with fluency and purity. When she conceived it to be time for us to part, I got by her order into a large osier basket, with an embroidered silk covering of her own manufacture. Then the two slaves who had brought me in were called to carry me out as a present from the favourite to her deluded lord, for under this pretence it is easy to screen any amorous exports from the inspection of the officers entrusted with the superintendence of the women. As for Farrukhnaz and myself, we were not slack in other devices to bring us together, and that lovely captive inspired me by degrees with as much love as she herself entertained for me. Our good understanding was kept a profound secret for full 2 months, notwithstanding the extreme difficulty in a seraglio of veiling the mysteries of love for any length of time from those uninitiated, whose eyes are jaundiced by their own disqualification. Neither was the discovery made at last by the means of envious spies. An unlucky chance disconcerted all our little arrangements, and the features of my fortune were at once aggravated into a frown. One day, when I had been introduced into the presence of the Sultana in the body of an artificial dragon, invented as a machine for a spectacle, while we were parleying most amicably together, Soliman, to whom we had given credit for having gone out of town, made his unwelcome appearance. He entered so abruptly into his favourite's apartment as scarcely to leave time for the old slave to give us notice of his approach. Still less was there any opportunity to conceal me. Thus, therefore, with all my enormities on my head, was I the first object which presented itself to the astonished eyes of the bashaw. He seemed considerably startled at the sight, and his countenance flashed with indignation on the instant. I considered myself as a wretch just hovering on the brink of the grave, and death seemed arrayed in all the paraphernalia of torture. As for Farrukhnaz, it was very evident in good truth that she was miserably frightened, but instead of owning her crime and imploring pardon, she said to Soliman, "My lord, before you pronounce my sentence, be pleased to hear my defence. Appearances doubtless condemn me, and it must strike you that I have committed an act of treason worthy the most dreadful punishment. It is true, I have brought this young captive hither. It is true that I have introduced him into my apartment with just such artifices as I should have used if I had entertained a violent passion for him. And yet I call our great prophet to witness, in spite of these seeming irregularities, I am not faithless to you. It was my wish to converse with this Christian slave for the purpose of disengaging him from his own sect and proselytizing him to that of the true believers. But I have found in him a principle of resistance for which I was not well prepared. I have, however, conquered his prejudices, and he came to give me an assurance that he would embrace Mahometanism. I do not mean to deny that it was an act of duty to have contradicted the favourite flatly, without paying the least attention to the dangerous predicament in which I stood. But my spirits were taken by surprise. The beloved partner of my imprudence was hovering on the brink of perdition, and my own fate was involved with hers. How could I do otherwise than give a silent and perturbed assent to her impious fiction? My tongue indeed refused to ratify it, but the bashaw, persuaded by my acquiescence that his mistress had told him the whole truth and nothing but the truth, suffered his angry spirit to be tranquillized. Madam, answered he, I am willing to believe that you have committed no infidelity towards me, and that the desire of doing a thing agreeable to the prophet has been the means of leading you on to risk so hazardous and delicate a proceeding. I forgive, therefore, your imprudence, on condition that this captive assumes the turban on the spot. He sent immediately for a priest to initiate me. My dress was changed with all due ceremony into the Turkish. They did just what they pleased with me, nor had I the courage to object, or, to do myself more justice, I knew not what was becoming of me in so dreadful a disorder of all my faculties and feelings. There are other good Christians in the world who have been guilty of apostatizing on less imminent emergencies. After the ceremony, I took my leave of the seraglio to go and possess myself, under the name of Saidi Hali, of an inferior office which Soliman had given me. I never saw the sultana more, but an eunuch of hers came one day to look after me. He brought with him, as a present from his mistress, jewels to a very considerable amount, accompanied with a letter in which the lady assured me she should never forget my generous compliance in turning Mahometan to save her life. In point of fact, besides these rich gifts lavished upon me by Farrukhnaz, I obtained through her interest a more considerable employment than my first, and in the course of 6 or 7 years became one of the richest renegados in the town of Algiers. You must be perfectly aware that if I assisted at the prayers put up by the Mussulmen in their mosques, or fulfilled the other observances of their religion, it was all a mere copy of my countenance. My inclination was always uniform and determined as to returning before my death into the bosom of our holy church, and with this view I looked forward to withdrawing some time or other into Spain or Italy with the riches I should have accumulated. But there seemed no reason whatever against enjoying life in the interval. I was established in a magnificent mansion, with gardens of extent and beauty, a numerous train of slaves, and a well-appointed equipage of pretty girls in my seraglio. Though the Mahometans are forbidden the use of wine in that country, they are not backward for the most part in their stolen libations. As for me, my orgies were without either a mask or a blush, after the manner of my brother renegados. I remember in particular 2 of my bottle companions, with whom I often drank down the night before we rose from table. One was a Jew and the other an Arabian. I took them to be good sort of people, and with that impression lived in unconstrained familiarity with them. One evening I invited them to sup at my house. On that very day a dog of mine died. It was a pet. We performed our pious ablutions on his lifeless clay, and buried him with all the solemn obsequies attendant on a Mahometan funeral. This act of ours was not designed to turn the religion we outwardly professed into ridicule. It was only to furnish ourselves with amusement, and give loose to a ludicrous whim which struck us in the moment of jollity, that of paying the last offices of humanity to my dog. This action was, however, very near laying me by the heels. On the following day there came a fellow to my house, saying, Master Sidi Holly, it is no laughing matter that induces me to pay you this visit. My employer, the Cadi, wants to have a word in your ear. Be so good, if you please, as just to step to his office without loss of time. An Arabian merchant who supped with you last night has laid an information respecting a certain act of irreverence perpetrated by you on occasion of a dog which you buried. It is on that charge that I summon you to appear this day before the judge, and in case of failure you are hereby warned that you will be the subject of a criminal prosecution. Away went he, leaving me to digest his discourse, but the citations stuck in my throat and took away my appetite. The Arabian had no reason whatever to set his face against me, and I could not comprehend the meaning of the dog's trick the scoundrel had played me. The circumstance, at all events, demanded my prompt attention. I knew the Cadi's character, a saint on the outside, but a sinner in his heart. Away went I, therefore, to wait on this judge, but not with empty pockets. He sent for me into his private room, and began upon me in all the vehemence of pious indignation. You are a fellow rejected out of paradise, a blasphemer of our holy law, a man loathsome and abominable to look upon. You have performed the funeral service of a Mussulman over a dog. What an act of sacrilege! Is it thus then that you reverence our most holy ceremonies? Have you only turned Mahometan to laugh at our devotions and our rites? My honoured master, answered I, the Arabian who has told you such a cock and bull story is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and more than that, he is even an accomplice in my crime, if it is one, to grant such rest as to peace parted souls to a faithful household servant, to an animal with more good qualities than half the two-legged Mahometans out of Christendom. His attachment, besides, to people of merit and consideration in the world was at once moral and sensible, and at his death he left several little tokens of remembrance to his friends. By his last will and testament he bequeathed his effects in the manner therein mentioned, and did me the honour to name me for his executor. This old crony came in for 20 crowns, that for 30, and another for a cool 100. But your worship is interested deeply in this instrument, pursued I, drawing out my purse. He has left you residuary legatee, and here is the amount of the bequest. The Cadi's gravity could not but relax after the posthumous kindness of his deceased friend, and he laughed outright in the face of the mock executor. As we were alone, there was no occasion to make wry mouths at the purse, and my acquittal was pronounced in these words: Go, Master Sidi Holly, it was a very pious act of yours to enlarge the obsequies of a dog who had so manly a fellow feeling for honest folks. End of Book 5, Chapter 1, Part 2.